Submit to those in authority. Cool. Awesome. I love it. That's great. Until your boss is toxic. Until the government is corrupt. Until your pastor is abusive. So at what point in time does this idea of submitting to authority, that's a biblical idea, mind you, at what point in time does that become enabling? Let's talk about that. Romans 13:1 says, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment." Hebrews 13:17 says this, "Obey your leaders and submit to them, for they are keeping watch over your souls as those who will have to give an account." And 1 Peter 2:18 says, "Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust." Submission to authority. It's all over Scripture. But let's be honest, this verse, these groups of verses, and there's plenty more, they hit different when your boss is toxic, your pastor is abusive, or your government is corrupt. Does submission still apply when authority is broken? When leaders abuse power? When systems are unjust? Or there is a line where submission becomes complicity, where obedience becomes enabling, where staying becomes sin. This episode is about that tension, because there is a biblical call to submit to authority, but there's also a biblical call to resist evil, protect the vulnerable, and stand for truth. The question is, how do you know which one applies? You know, it seems like we live in an age of institutional distrust. We don't trust the authorities anymore. We don't trust our churches. We don't trust our government. We don't trust our hospitals or doctors' offices. And we barely trust our schools. Now, here's the thing. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. Actually, I'm leaning more towards that's right, because a lot of people distrust these institutions for good reason. Right? Every other day, it seemed like there was a corruption scandal of some sort within the government, within the church, within these schools. I mean, every day something is being uncovered that continues to erode that trust. So I don't blame people at all. Not in the slightest bit. Because the institutions, these very same institutions that demanded trust, have systematically broken it. And ultimately what happens is we fall into these two categories now. And it just seems like all over the place we're just divided based on either or, A, B, 1, 2. And this is another example of that, right? Because there's people who believe still in these institutions and they're just blindly following them. Common things that they would say here is to never question authority. And unfortunately, you'll hear this a lot within Christianity, because it's just because of those verses that I read to you earlier, all authority is put in place by God, so you can't question them at all ever. So our main job is to submit, point blank period, right? The problem is this enables abuse. Now you have the other end, right, where you completely do not trust any authority at all whatsoever. And usually if you fall in that camp, you fall with the idea of resisting all power structures, tearing down the system, damage to the system, abandon the system, all that fun stuff. And you tend to find a lot of the conspiracy theorists there too. That's another thing though. But ultimately, this is also kind of off mark because this breeds chaos. Both of those extremes, they're missing wisdom. They're lacking wisdom. So on the one hand, where you just submit to any and all authority, and the other where it's just like you completely distrust, you do not submit to any authority at all. Those are the two extremes, and they both lack wisdom. So what is actual biblical submission? So biblical submission, and this is what my suggestion is, we kind of line up that way. It takes out a lot of the noise. Of course, I'm going to say that, but what it is basically it's respect for order and structure. It's a willingness to be under authority when it's functioning properly, rightly, justly. And it's also recognition that God establishes that authority for good. Check out Romans 13:4. Okay. But what it isn't, see, this biblical submission is not a blind obedience to evil. Okay? Acts 5:29 says we must obey God rather than human beings, right? When authority commands sin, you don't submit. Duh. But it's also not passivity in the face of abuse. So if you see your neighbor getting churned up, you don't turn a blind eye. Proverbs 31:8-9 says, speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. So again, when authority harms the vulnerable, that's when you intervene. So then when do you submit? When do you submit properly, right? It's when authority is functioning as God designed. That's when you submit. And what does that mean? It means that authority is providing protection. It's maintaining order. It's serving the common good. It's using its power to empower. And obviously the opposite of that is to control. So a proper, moral, just authority uses its power to empower others and not control them. Some examples of this would be your boss who leads with integrity. Hopefully your non-jerk boss who leads with a moral compass, who leads with full quality, good character with integrity, right? It's also the pastor who serves sacrificially. And it's also the government that protects the vulnerable. I have to place emphasis on that because it's clear we're missing a great deal of that, and we've been missing a great deal of that for decades. But then in turn, what is your response? Your response then to a proper and just authority is to submit willingly, not begrudgingly, not with resentment. Submission as worship when authority is good. But when authority is imperfect but not abusive, they make mistakes, they're not always right, but they're trying to serve well. See, that's where discernment has to kick in. You have to have a little bit of wisdom to understand or at least get an inkling of what their intentions are here. You'll be able to kind of separate the two, the ones who don't care. Prime example, and the first comes to mind, doctors. You could kind of sense the difference between the doctors who don't care and the doctors who do. The doctors who don't care, they'll just churn through and see as many patients as they can. But there is a definite, clear distinction between the doctors who do care and the doctors who don't. Because you might even get the doctors who fall within that same system who care, and they might spend, hey, you know what? I'll spend a half hour with them instead of 15 minutes. Something simple like that. But examples of this form of authority Also come down to like the boss who's not great but means well, right? They're still a terrible leader, but they have proper intentions at the least, right? Or the pastor who's learning and growing, still making mistakes, flawed, but they're learning and growing, right? Or a government that institutes policies that you don't fully agree with, but they're not like unjust. Your response here in this form of authority is to submit with discernment, like I just mentioned already, right? You can disagree respectfully, you can voice your concerns, but you still submit to the role, right? So you're not trying to breed chaos here. So imperfect authority doesn't negate authority. They're still in an authority position and you still have to submit to it. Now, when submission is about your character and not their worthiness, things change a little bit. So 1 Peter 2:18 says, submit even to harsh masters, not because they deserve it, but because it refines you. It's a sign of good character for you to submit to authority, even if they're unjust. But here's a kicker here, right? Because it's very hard to do, very, very hard to do, because you have to be able to submit in a way that doesn't validate their behavior. So going back to that second form of authority, where it's just like they mean well, but they're kind of missing the mark, right? You can respectfully disagree in that instance. Well, for sure, you have to respectfully disagree here. You have to, at the end of the day, still submit to their authority, but you want to do it in a way that doesn't validate their behavior, but it also, and you don't want to miss the opportunity to build up on your own character. That's a big one there. So a large part of submitting to terrible authority is building you up, right? But there's also the rub. And again, I'm not saying this is easy. But the rub here is also part of building up your character, and building you up is also building up your faith. So for a Christian, this is a no-brainer. Submit to that authority, build up your character, but also place your trust in God. But again, this has limits. God doesn't have limits, but submission to this type of authority has limits. It becomes so one limitation is when that authority becomes demanding of compliance in an ungodly way, right? Like if it's asking you to lie, it's asking you to harm others, it's asking you to violate your conscience. Okay. Example of this is like a boss that wants you to commit fraud. Like that's kind of a no-brainer, right? Or a pastor that demands control over your personal decisions. Now, this one's sneaky because there are plenty of crooked pastors out there, and I'm not saying they're all crooked. I'm just saying I have physically seen with my own two eyes crooked pastors who would ease their way into people's personal decision making, that intimate part, especially between husband and wife, and somehow pastors are in the middle of it and they're orchestrating a whole bunch of stuff. That's a problem, right? That's where authority is asking for too much. But it also is one of those things where government, and this is one that really just sits on the forefront of my brain, where government mandates sin. I won't dig too much into that. I think a lot of people kind of understand what's going on there. So anyway, at the end of the day, what your response becomes for that type of authority is that you must obey God despite what that authority says. You must obey God rather than human beings. Okay? So what do? You respectfully refuse. You explain why, but you also accept the consequences thereof. So you can't open your mouth, you can't start to bark and not expect anything to come back from it. Another time to set some boundaries here is when authority is abusive, right? When the verbal, emotional, physical, spiritual abuse of power, whatever it may be, when they're manipulative, or when they're exploiting some group or some people for some reason. So examples of this would be a boss who demeans, threatens, or harasses their employees, a pastor who uses spiritual authority to control and to isolate and to harm others, any relationship where the power of that relationship is weaponized, right? And what you should do in those cases is set firm boundaries. You name the abuse, you protect yourself, and you seek accountability, right? Submission doesn't mean tolerating abuse. There is no case, there is no situation, there is no individual authority group, and at no point in time should you condone abuse because it comes from authority. Another time you need to set boundaries is when you need space to discern. So you need a little bit of time, you need a little bit of space to figure out what's actually going on here, right? So you're not sure if it is abusive or if it's not, or if it's just really hard to deal with, right? You need perspective and you need time to figure out what's going on, what's actually happening, right? And in that case, what you should do is to create that space for a certain amount of time, temporarily, right? It's not necessarily defiance, but it's just saying that you need space to think and to think clearly. At that point in time, one of the best things you could do is to talk to wise counsel, right? Talk, some trusted people. Hopefully you have those people. Right? And as an aside, I've been talking a lot about this idea of integration, being an integrated being. You're balanced and strong in heart, mind, body, spirit, all relationships, endurance, all the arenas you are strong in. You're integrated. Being an integrated being helps you discern what's actually happening in this case here. Okay. So when do you leave? When do you take yourself away from this particular authority group or whatever, a person in authority or whatever you want to call it? You basically, when the authority persists in unrepentant abuse, so they just keep abusing people, they keep doing wrong, this is when you separate yourself, right? You've set the boundaries, you've sought accountability, and nothing has changed. Your response is to leave. Okay? That's not rebellion. That's not responding to sin with sin. That's removing yourself from the situation. And you can't submit to something that's destroying you. So there's this idea, and I was trying to figure out the best way to talk about this topic as it pertains to marriage, because one of the most abused lines in the Bible is, "Wives, submit to your husbands." And let me tell you, it's bad. It's bad. I mean, that's one of the most abused Bible lines, Bible verses. Wives, submit to your husbands. And so this whole idea of submission has become such a nasty thing. Don't you dare tell any woman to submit to her husband at any point in time, especially if they're not a Christian, right? And it has such a negative connotation to it because of these authority principles here, because of what I was telling you, right? So at some point in time, if you're considering a marriage, you can take a lot of these things. Like, hey, look, especially from a wife's perspective, my husband's a decent authority, and he knows what he's doing. He's moral, he's just. Okay, submit, right? If he's hard, I disagree, I can state those disagreements because he's not actually sinning. He's just flawed, which is most husbands in this case. Let's just be real. But that doesn't necessarily mean, hey, look, I'm out, or you enable whatever actions that he's doing, or you completely disregard and don't trust and you cause chaos and all that fun stuff. You don't do that end either, right? So a lot of what I'm telling you right now isn't just for, authority dealing with the government. This is also authority dealing with your household. And again, it's in a perfectly set up system, the way God intended it to be, the way God set it up to be, at least the way it seems, there should be no abuse in it at all whatsoever. Verbal, emotional, mental, or spiritual. Point blank, period. Full stop. So keep that in mind. I'm also talking about that wives submit to your husbands thing, even though it carries such still a negative connotation to it. I mean, part of the problem also is because husbands kind of forgot that we were supposed to lay our lives down for our wives and all that fun stuff, and we're supposed to treat them how we want to be treated as well. And there's a whole bunch of other things to that, but they just isolated that one line. Anyway, listen. Again, you can't submit to something that's destroying you. But another time when you need to leave, when you need to separate yourself from it, is when staying enables harm to others. So your submission allows the abuse to continue. Vulnerable people are being hurt in this case. And look, you get in some murky territory when you're talking about this in marriage. I'm really thinking about this in government. But I guess it all kind of holds true, right? But it's like when you see vulnerable people being hurt, then you have to kind of, and they're being hurt because of your submission. That's where you have to leave, right? Because what happens is your submission gives legitimacy to the evil, to the sin. Your response in that case is to leave and expose it if necessary, right? Again, we go back to Proverbs 31:8 says, speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. Ephesians 5:11 says, have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. So if you're silent, that does actually mean you're being complicit. Another one another reason to leave that particular set of that authority, not to submit to that authority, is when God is calling you out. Sometimes God will remove you from authority structures. I know this firsthand, and I'm experiencing it right now. God is calling you out, not because you're rebellious, but because he's redirecting you. He's moving you to where you need to be. Examples of this is found in the Bible. Obviously, David fled Saul. Saul was king. David was out. Because Saul wanted to take him out. He going loco. He lost him. He lost him. Right? Paul left synagogues when they rejected truth. Submission to God's leading will always be greater than submission to broken authority. Biblical submission is real, but it is not blind. It is not unlimited. And it requires wisdom to know when it applies and when it doesn't. Integration is what gives you that discernment. So there's this role that integration plays. And again, I'm talking about integration again, but there's this role that integration plays in discernment. Okay. And I do talk about this a great deal in the book as well, in the SCAL method, your guide to total being fitness, or your guide for total being fitness. Right. If you're strong in your spirit, your soul anchored, right? You know who God is, and you can distinguish his voice from authority's demands. See, you're not dependent in that case on human approval. If your heart is regulated, you can feel the abuse without reacting immediately. You can process fear, anger, and confusion, and you don't make decisions from pure emotion. If your mind is sharp, you can think critically, you can identify manipulation, and you can see patterns. You're not easily gaslit. And if your body is strong, you have the physical capacity to leave if needed. Stress doesn't incapacitate you. You can act, not just endure. But if your endurance is built, you can sustain through difficulty while discerning. And you don't quit at the first challenge. But you also don't stay past the breaking point. And if your relationships are deep, you have an outside perspective that you can go to. People you know will tell you the truth. And that's invaluable right there. You're not isolated. And a lot of times, isolation enables abuse. So integration gives you the clarity to know when to stay, when to set boundaries, and when to leave. So let's talk about some objections here. Let's talk about what some of you may be thinking that would go against this, right? Like the first one is like, doesn't this just justify rebellion? Isn't that just what this is? You're telling us to rebel against improper authority. And I'm not saying no. There's a difference between rebellion, which is saying I don't want to submit, so I won't, and discernment. This authority is asking me to sin or enable harm, so I can't. Big difference between the two, right? Biblical rebellion is sin, sure, right? That's a pride-based refusal to submit. It's almost like saying, I know better than everyone else, so this is what I'm going to do, and I'm not going to listen to them, right? You basically made yourself as the ultimate authority. Biblical resistance, though, that's obedience. God-centered refusal to enable evil. That's what that is, right? You're basically saying, I must obey God rather than humans. And you keep God as your ultimate authority. Easy. The difference is motive and integration. So another one is, what if I'm wrong about the authority? You might be. And that's also why you need discernment and some good relationships, because you would rely on community then, outside perspective of some sort. Right? You know, some wise counsel. Okay. The process then, though, becomes you shouldn't decide in isolation. You shouldn't make that decision without conferring with someone else. So at that point, bring trusted people you trust, people you're connected to that you ride or die. Bring them in. Okay. And test your perceptions. Let them know, hey, this is what I'm thinking. What you think? So here's what I see. Do you see the same thing? Things like that. If 3 or 4 wise people see the same thing, then you're probably right. And even if you're wrong, it's better to set a boundary and discover that you didn't need it than to stay and be destroyed. I mean, you can always return, and you can't. Look, if you thought it was improper and bad authority and you left, you can always go back because there's still good authority if that's the case, right? There's still a morally just authority. But you can't always recover. You can't always recover from bad authority, abusive authority. It's tougher to do. Another objection might be like, isn't this just cultural influence and not at all biblical? Now, it's like, isn't this the way of the world? Well, no, right? The culture has overcorrected on authority, though, right? Everything is questioned and all structures are suspect. So it's like, you could ask somebody if they believe that there's such thing as a good corporation. Ask somebody right now, present day, whether they think, well, maybe there's some people that do think that the government is good and non-corrupt in a general sense. I don't know how they think that with all this information we know now, but you get my point. Here's the thing. That's the wrong idea to have, though, right? The Bible itself gives examples of godly resistance. The Hebrew midwives refused Pharaoh's command to kill babies in Exodus 1. Right? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused to bow in Daniel 3. Peter and John refused to stop preaching in Acts 4 and 5. So it's like, this isn't cultural, it's biblical. Submission has its limits, especially when authority demands evil. Does submission to authority still apply? Yes, when authority is functioning as God designed, when it's serving, protecting, and empowering. But no, when authority demands sin, when it abuses power, when staying enables harm. The question isn't, should I always submit? It's, what is this authority asking of me, and does it align with God's design? Integration gives you the clarity to answer that question. Soul anchored so you're not dependent on human approval, heart regulated so you can feel the abuse without reacting rashly, mind sharp so that you can identify manipulation, body strong so you can leave if needed, endurance built so you can sustain while discerning, relationships deep so you're not deciding in isolation. Build integration. Then you'll have the wisdom to know when to submit, when to set boundaries, and when to walk away.